Well, joining us now in the studio to discuss the latest regional events is Calev Ben-David, senior correspondent for Bloomberg Israel. Calev, good to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Arieh, as always.
Well, Calev, the summoning of the European Union ambassadors after the Israeli ambassadors were summoned in Europe, is this the right tactic for Netanyahu's government to take?
Well, I don't know if it's the right tactic, but I think you have to look at the context and background in which it's happening. There is a tremendous concern in the Israeli government about developments in Europe towards Israel, not just diplomatically. We also have seen in the last couple of months changes in the or developments in the sanctions, economic sanctions against Israel. Just last week, the second biggest pension fund in the Netherlands announced that it will no longer invest in the five biggest banks in Israel because of their investments or their operations in the West Bank. We had the whole controversy over the so-called Horizon 2020 program of the EU, where they would not give grants to any institutions, even those Israeli universities that may have programs over the Green Line. So a lot of concern in the Netanyahu government about what's the developments in Europe. And then you had the situation yesterday when the Israeli ambassadors summoned. So there was a lot of frustration, and there may be some acting out of frustration, but this kind of tit-for-tat is very standard diplomatic, so it shouldn't be a tactic. It shouldn't be any surprise when Israel as well as any other country.
Well, Calev, we heard the comments made by Prime Minister Netanyahu. You were there last night. You heard him say these comments. Is this complaint of hypocrisy falling on deaf ears, or does he really have an impact?
No, well, I think that you have to understand, really, there's two Europes, in a sense, that he's addressing. There's the Europe of the European Union, the EU bureaucracy based in Brussels. We see its face here primarily in Catherine Ashton, who's their sort of a foreign minister. I think there his complaints are falling into deaf ears. I mean, they definitely have a view, very firmly against the Israeli settlements, and you do hear more criticism of Israel. I think Netanyahu's tactic is actually directed more to some of the governments in the EU, that he wants to have them maybe rein back their representatives in Brussels. Primarily Germany and the UK probably would be his primarily concern there. So I think that's really who he's talking to here, those governments, and we'll see going forward if it has that kind of impact.
Well, Calev, that's Europe. United States is Israel's best friend. And the comments this week by Defense Minister Moshe Ayalon, do you think that's going to cause any damage between the relations?
It's interesting discussing that after the thing with Europe, because we see how vocal the Prime Minister is, in responding to criticism of Israeli settlements in the West Bank from Europe. But of course, with the U.S., everything, even Ayalon's private comments generated this public apology that Ayalon had to make. And of course, the Prime Minister went to the Knesset. So clearly, the Israel shows you puts a totally different value on the relationship with the U.S. than it does with Europe. And to answer your question, no, the U.S.-Israel relationship is strong enough that it's going to sort of, this is just another blip on it. It's really, even what's going on, the friction over Kerry, I don't think the overlying, there are many other players in the U.S.-Israel relationship. There's the Congress, which is not the administration. There's the U.S. public. There's the security relationship, which is as strong as ever. So no, I don't think it's going to have a lasting impact.
Well, Calev, the bottom line is the peace process, and we appear to be approaching a moment of truth. Is the Prime Minister ready to make these political risks?
To the degree of is he willing to take a political risk? He, in a sense, is already taking some political risk. I think he is willing to take up to a certain degree of some political risk. He might be emboldened now by the changing position of Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, who has suddenly emerged in a sort of more dovish position, and that maybe will help him within the Likud and in his government. But I do think there's a limit to how far Netanyahu is willing to go. I mean, we might see some flexibility in terms of the language on some of the things, in terms of the arrangements in the Jordan Valley, even in terms of and also on the language of the Palestinian Jewish state in the so-called framework agreement carries, but I certainly don't think he's willing to. There's been a lot of discussion I've had, maybe because of Arieh O'Sullivan's passing. Would he leave the Likud, form a new party outside the Likud, the way Arieh O'Sullivan is? I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu is ready to would take that step.
What about the other side? Is there a willingness on the Palestinian side to take these risks?
Right, that's good, because it's a good question, because that's the other side of the equation. I think if Netanyahu perceived a really reliable peace partner on the other side, he might be more willing to take those risks and might be willing to even sort of break up his own party and go to the people. But whether Mahmoud Abbas is that reliable partner or not, I'll leave to the side, but I don't think the Prime Minister believes that he is. And that's one of the reasons I don't think that he's willing to take that extra step where he would jeopardize his own government for seeking a peace agreement that is very unlikely to achieve in the first place with Abbas.
But it seems, Calev, that when all is said and done and the Americans do come out with a paper, if they do come out, we are back where we were 14 years ago. And that was followed by a really serious display of violence on the Palestinian side, and afterwards. Are we on the verge of that happening again?
Look, we might be on the verge of another diplomatic disappointment. I think that has to be, taken into account. Are we on the verge of violence, despite the uptick in violence that you see in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? I don't think that's really a more isolated issue. It's not public in the way that we saw in the first and second. I don't think widespread violence will be going. I think most likely, though, we're looking at a middle road there, which is they come out with some kind of vague enough framework agreement that keeps both sides, the Israeli and the Palestinians, talking, and the Americans meeting in the talks. And that's really what everybody really wants right now, or is comfortable with, is that just at least keep the sides talking.
Very quickly, we just heard Caroline Glick of the Jerusalem Post comment that the American policies in the Middle East were like drunk driving. What do you feel about that?
I think that's look. You could definitely criticize the Obama administration for either flip-flops or disengagement in some areas of the Middle East. But listen, they inherited a bad situation. And let's keep in mind, yes, the administration's focusing on the Palestinian conflict with all this happening. I recall the Bush administration calling the Annapolis conference and focusing on the peace process when the policy in Iraq was falling apart, and Afghanistan. So it's nothing new, very typical of American presidents in their second term to focus on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And as what's happening in the Middle East, it's really bigger than the U.S. and bigger than the U.S.'s ability to direct the events that are happening.
All right, Calev, always a pleasure to have you on our show. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Pleasure, and Shabbat Shalom to you and the viewers, Arieh.